Welcome to the Bulwark podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. Often on this podcast, we have repeat guests, but I am happy to tell you that we have a first time guest that we have been looking forward to for a very long time. So, welcome to Lis Smith, first time on the Bulwark podcast.
Thanks for having me, Charlie. I am a longtime listener, but thrilled to be here for my first of hopefully many times.
All right. So, for people's background, Liz is a Democratic consultant, and she was, you might remember, the senior communications director for Pete Buttigieg's 2020 presidential campaign about 100 years ago. She's a veteran of other political campaigns, including director of Barack Obama's 2012 Rapid Response Team. So, we really wanted to get your perspective on a lot of things. And look, I don't want to ambush you here, but I am going to ask you why Democrats suck so much at politics, just so you know. This is going to come up later on the podcast, but we have to start with the latest batshit crazy episode in the Republican Party. Although that doesn't seem appropriate for this whole, it's all about the pedophile line now on the right. And I wrote about this in my newsletter this morning. I regret to tell you the gap between Marjorie Taylor Greene, the right wing media, and Republicans in the Senate, like Josh Hawley, is shrinking. So after the announcement that Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, and Mitt Romney were all going to vote for Ketanji Brown Jackson, Marjorie Taylor Greene tweeted out yesterday, Murkowski, Collins, and Romney are pro-pedophile. They just voted for KBJ. And then we get this truly revolting insinuation from a Federalist editor and Bradley Prize winner, Molly Hemingway, who tweeted about Mitt Romney's endorsement of KBJ. The only new info since he voted against her a few months ago was increased awareness of her, quote, soft on pedos, unquote, approach, which makes this new Romney position super interesting. Really super interesting, as Steve Hayes from the Dispatch said. Why is it super interesting? Say what you mean. Enough bullshit innuendo. Are you suggesting that Mitt Romney is a pedophile or just pro-pedophile, you coward? Which I think slightly understates the legitimate reaction. So Liz, from across the aisle, what does this look like? It feels like within the last just few weeks, the right wing and the Republican Party are just all in, not just on the culture war in general, because that's not new, but all in on it's all about the gays. It's all about the gays and this pivot to if you support gay rights or you oppose anti-gay legislation, then you're not just wrong on the issue, you're a groomer or a pedophile. And here you have this coming from elected members of Congress.
Yeah,
Yeah,
well,
what the hell?
it's obviously it's very troubling, and keep in mind that Ketanji Brown Jackson is someone who was endorsed by the FOP, supported by former Bush
Cops. Yeah.
administration officials. I don't think anyone thinks that the Fraternal Order of Police is a pro pedo organization. And the hearings, I think, were extremely disgraceful for Republicans like Lindsey Graham, Josh Hawley, Tom Cotton, Ted Cruz. It was sort of a race to the bottom. And while I don't think the hearings are, really penetrated that much with voters, it does signal to me an opportunity for Democrats to go on the offensive a little bit more on the culture wars. We've been getting hosed a little bit in recent
A
months on some
little
of these
bit.
issues. Yeah, a little bit. And we can talk about that later. And I'd
Mm,
be happy to.
yeah.
I think that Democrats have not been handling these issues great. But this gives us an opportunity to say, hey, if Democrats are disciplined to go out in the midterms, talk about how they want to reduce healthcare costs, increase wages, provide more economic relief to the American people. And Republicans are focused on, these bizarre pedo attacks, banning books, finding solutions to problems that don't exist. And if your issue as a voter is that you're sick of the chaos in Washington, you're sick of things getting done, then Republicans, aren't there looking out for you because there's not some big pedo epidemic in the country. And I think that this is exhibit A of how of what Republicans will do if they take if when they take back the House and Senate, and it would be a disaster for the American people who are feeling pain with inflation and the economy.
Okay, this all makes sense, but why is it not happening? And I guess this comes to this basic question. You have the Republican Party. This is the party of Madison Cawthorn and Paul Gosar and Marjorie Taylor Greene out there, pursuing these extremist, batshit crazy ideas, and yet Democrats are losing to them. How can Democrats be losing to a party this unhinged? And I guess this comes back to you're saying that this is an opportunity. Why have they not taken advantage of this? Mona Charen in the Bulwark, raises the question. These are really despicable people. These are people who go to white supremacist conferences, and yet the average American doesn't know who they are.
Right.
Why have Democrats failed so, dramatically in making them the face of the Republican Party?
Hmm. So a few things. I don't, and I read a Politico story the other day with some Democrats saying, "Let's make Madison Cawthorn the face of the party."
Mhm.
I don't think that that is going to be an effective strategy, and I don't think that nationalizing these races is going to be effective for Democrats. I really, really think that Democrats need to look to the strategies that worked in cycles like 2018, where, yeah, you had a batshit crazy guy as the commander in chief, Donald Trump,
Yeah.
who every day was out there tweeting batshit crazy stuff. But Democrats didn't, run ads with their hair on fire about him. They stayed focused on the bread and butter issues that the American people care about: healthcare, wages, this sexy things that maybe don't drive uh, eyeballs to MSNBC, but
Mhm.
are the things that voters care about. The issue that that Democrats have is the environment. Um, the job market is strong, sure, but people are really feeling the pinch of inflation. And we really, really, really need to understand where voters are and talk to them about the issues that they care about. It's inflation, the rise in violent crime,
Right.
concerns about education and school closing, and the fact that we as Democrats are seen as less in touch with voters on the economy, that we're at a deficit on education issues. That should be that is really troubling to me, and I think that those are the things that we should focus on versus
O
getting into this back and forth on the culture wars with them.
Okay, so how do you explain that deficit? Is it just a messaging problem? Or is it that, the high profile Democrats really are out of touch with what the sentiment of the public is on those kinds of issues?
I chalk it up to the environment, and I hate to use this word. It's the dirtiest word in American politics, but there is a sense of malaise out there
Mm,
after
mm.
two
Getting
after
all that Jimmy Carter vibe.
I
Just,
know, I
okay.
know, I know, I know.
PTSD.
But after 2 years of a pandemic, if you look at focus groups, you hear people say that they're tired, they're exhausted, they're hopeless. They
Yeah,
see inflation. There's been a spike in
yeah.
mental health problems. Schools have been closed. Crime has gone up, and you see that voters can't really identify anything that Democrats have done. And it's not because Democrats haven't done anything. It's again that people do feel this sense of malaise post pandemic.
Right.
And I think the way that Democrats have got to break through it is to say, yes, I understand your pain. I feel your pain. And we need to continue to address the problems. But let's look at what the Republicans are offering.
Well, well, wait, 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 wait. But before we get to that, why has that not happened yet? Well,
um,
I mean, what is this disconnect? Is
well,
it because I mean, I've heard people say, well, it's because, Democrats don't tout their accomplishments. They don't say it enough. Is that really an explanation though for why there is this disconnect?
Well, I don't know that going out there and touting our accomplishments is the best strategy right now. We've
Okay.
gone out there, we've talked about ARP, we've talked about BIF, but Americans are still hurting. And whenever we go out there and say the job market's so great, unemployment is so low, it doesn't really connect with how voters feel. And we're
Uh-huh.
not going to be able to, to tell voters that their feelings aren't legitimate. And
Ooh, that's
what
interesting. So, I mean, there really is a conflict between touting your accomplishments and then being in touch with, "I feel your pain," that the voters are feeling or their disillusionment.
Yeah, and we
Gotcha.
saw that in 2010. I was in Ohio in 2010. I was the communications director for um, the governor at the time, Ted Strickland, and on the national level, you had Barack Obama going out there and saying, "Look at how many jobs we've added post recession. We're on the rebound." But voters didn't really feel it. And what we had to do in Ohio was one, run a more localized race that was divorced from sort of the national atmosphere and go on the offensive against our Republican opponent and say, this is a guy who wants to give tax breaks to the rich, outsource jobs, um, you uh, doesn't support
Yeah.
Obamacare, whatever it is. And I really think that what Democrats need to do is go on the offensive in that way against.
Wait, but that didn't work.
It,
That
it,
didn't work in
well,
2010.
we significantly overperformed Democrats in other races. Ted lost by
That's right.
2.0 points versus, the shellacking that Democrats took in states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and
Wisconsin.
yeah, and Wisconsin, right?
Yeah.
So similar ones, but and Ted's race was held up as one of the best losing campaigns of this cycle because we were able to go more on the offensive. It wasn't enough.
This is not reassuring.
I know, but
This is oddly not reassuring because I will tell you that I remember 2010 very, very well,
yeah,
because this year feels very much like that mood, that there's just kind of like this huge thing that, I mean, I don't wave, but I mean, sometimes the environment is, as you point out, the environment is so overwhelming that no matter how good your campaign is or no matter what your talking points are, you're just not going to break through.
right. And you have a feeling that it could be like 2010, it could be like 2018. And there have been some indicators that don't bode well. The Virginia governor's race, the New Jersey governor's race, which was extremely close. And for us to minimize our losses, we really do need to draw that contrast. But I think where you and I maybe disagree here, Charlie, is I don't necessarily think it's got to be a top down thing that's being led by Chuck Schumer and Democrats in Washington. I think it's
Hmm.
really incumbent on members of the House, Senate candidates to really run their own races, to not tie themselves necessarily to the national Democratic brand and go on the offense against Republicans and say that every step of the way.
Actually, we
In the
do agree on this. Yeah,
yeah, that
I do agree
and
with you.
yeah, and but that these are people who are trying to take credit for things that they voted against, an ARP with Biff, and they're offering absolutely no solutions for what they would do over the next 2 years. Like, let's be real about what's going to happen if the Republicans take the House, if they take the Senate. It's going to be nonstop hearings about Hunter Biden. It's going to be the culture wars that we've seen in the states, the war against transgender people, war against CRT. And what is that going to do to help people economically? Nothing. And I think that those are the sorts of contrasts that we need to drive.
Since we're in historical analogies, I keep thinking of Harry Truman back in 1948. After the Democrats shellacking in the midterm elections of 1946. Now the Republicans control; they were in power. This is the slight complication here. They were in power back then, at least in Congress, and Truman ran against the Do Nothing Congress. And it's much more complicated for the Democrats because you're in charge of everything, and so
Right.
therefore you're responsible for everything. But your point is, turn this around and say, look, you have a Republican Party that has no agenda. I mean, they don't want to do anything. Well, okay, with one possible exception, he says, interrupting himself. What do you think about the Rick Scott gambit, where he's basically saying, yes, we absolutely ought to raise taxes on the 50% of Americans that don't pay them? Is that a target rich environment, do you think, for Democrats?
Yeah, it is. And I don't know how much, talking about the Rick Scott agenda is going to work in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania,
Yeah.
Ohio, wherever it is. But locking the GOP, locking Republicans into their unpopular positions is really important for Democrats. And while the Democratic brand might be hurting, we see in poll after poll that Democratic priorities are largely popular, Republican priorities are not. And we've got to be very explicit about what the Republican Party supports and what they don't support. They're a party that supports tax breaks for the rich. Democrats are a party that supports, lowering healthcare costs, expanding Medicaid for home care, making sure
Mm-hmm.
Medicare can negotiate prescription drug costs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the more that we can show that Republicans are actually the party that's out of touch, Democrats are the people who feel your pain, understand the concerns of middle
Mm-hmm.
class families, the better for us. And the Rick Scott plan provides sort of a blueprint for that.
Okay, so I want to talk to you about the various Senate primaries, the role of crazy on both sides of the aisle, or extreme on both sides of the aisle, and also get your take on Joe Biden. But let's do this after this. As you've probably noticed, the cost of everything continues to rise, and I mean everything, especially if there's an interest rate tied to it. Have you seen some of those numbers lately? Debt is about to get much more expensive very soon. You've got to take care of it before it's too late. And you can get a great deal right now by calling American Financing because their mortgage consultants review your entire financial picture, helping you save up to $1,000 a month, whether it's a lower rate or debt consolidation, even helping you access cash. They can do it all, but only if it's going to make a difference for you. So why not learn more? If you start soon, you could skip 2 payments and maybe close in as fast as 10 days. Call 888 991 9788. That's 888 991 9788. Or visit AmericanFinancing.net and tell them that Charlie Sykes sent you. NMLS 182334, NMLSconsumeraccess.org. Okay, we are back with Liz Smith, who was the senior communications director for Pete Buttigieg's presidential campaign. I guess, can I ask you a really awkward question?
Well, I guess I don't really have much of an option, but go ahead.
Yeah. Well, Joe Biden.
Yeah.
How is Joe Biden doing, in terms of the presidential leadership? Because his poll numbers are just absolutely abysmal. And look, a lot of it does have to do with the environment, inflation. But I just sense there's this disconnect that voters are actually thinking that maybe he's a little old, that he's a little slow, that he has not really been able to connect with the public in a way that I think a lot of people thought that he was before the 2020 elections. I just want to get your sense because you were in the trenches during
Mhm.
that campaign. He's the leader of your party. Give me your report card on Joe Biden and why Joe Biden's numbers are so awful right now.
Well, the reality is, and
Mhm,
it's this isn't really something that he can say, but it's not dissimilar from what Barack Obama faced in the first couple years of his term, which is that he was handed a shit sandwich. And there are
mhm,
a lot of things that are out of his control. COVID, the never
mhm.
ending variants, and the general sense of exhaustion that COVID has produced in the American public. Inflation, Joe Biden can't, single handedly fix the supply chain, or fix gas prices. But the problem when you're president is that the buck stops with you. You get blamed for everything. So a lot of these things are out of his control, and it might be unfair to blame him for them, but the American people do. And that, again, is why I think it's important for him to go more on the offensive. The issue I see with Joe Biden is that he's not the type of guy that is hyper partisan, that likes to go hyper negative against his opponents. That's not something that comes naturally to him. And that might be holding him back a lot. But really, I think that his numbers come down largely to things that are out of his control. And that's why, to the extent he can control things, like framing the attack against the Republicans, he really should try to do. And I'd like to see the White House do that more.
But there are a lot of things that are within his control, and Again, he has been somewhat undisciplined in his rhetoric. He stepped on his own lines. I mean, I think, a perfect example of this was it last week? I lost track of time here. When he was in Poland and gave a very, very strong speech about the war in Ukraine, and then stepped on it by saying that Vladimir Putin needs to be, cannot be allowed to remain in office. And then his White House walked it back. I mean, it's those moments like that where you go, come on, come on,
Well,
man. Come
I,
on,
you know,
man.
I so there's a reason on campaigns that I'm never very popular among either the foreign policy advisors or the lawyers, because I tend to think that foreign policy advisors are a little too conservative sometimes in the advice that they give. I did not think that what Joe Biden said was this massive, massive gaffe.
No.
And you've seen him sort of stand by some of his stronger comments in
Yeah.
recent days about
Well, he was
Vladimir
right the first
Putin.
time, yeah.
Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. Sure. Was there in the moment, was there a little confusion about it? Yeah. But overall, I don't think that they needed to walk that back in the way that they did. And the problem with Ukraine is just that foreign policy is not top of mind for the American people. It's
Even
not like
now.
we have. Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. And if you look at the
Okay.
polls, it really is the economy. It's all coming down to the economy. And yeah, they see the tragic photos coming out of Ukraine. They see the TV reports, but it's not something that touches their everyday lives. And there is a big disconnect between, maybe what you and I care about, what people on cable news care about, and what the American people care about. And again, if you look at focus groups, what people care about, it's education, it's inflation, it's violent crime. People really aren't bringing up Ukraine. They're not bringing up the
They're
war in
not.
Russia. They're not. They're just not.
Hmm.
They just aren't, because it doesn't touch their everyday lives. And the more that Democrats understand that we need to speak to kitchen table issues, the better off we'll be. And when Democrats do that, that is when we win.
Okay, you've addressed, I think, one of the most important questions, which is, will Ukraine move the needle at all? Does Ukraine change anything? Is there this slide in public opinion? Because sometimes it takes something really dramatic to change public opinion. After Pearl Harbor, after 9/11,
Right. Nine
Ukraine, of course,
eleven.
is
I was
not
thinking. Yeah.
is not here. I was thinking about these issues that you just mentioned, whether it is inflation, whether it is education, and a year ago, one of the themes that I picked up from Democrats, including many of the talking heads on cable TV that you just referenced, was kind of a denial that these were serious problems, that it's been belated, that there really was no crime problem. I can't tell you how many articles I read from people who say, "Oh, no, inflation is exaggerated." Well, no, there's no problem going on in the schools. We shouldn't actually be concerned about all of this. I think this is a problem for Democrats that they have been late to the party acknowledging the reality of these concerns. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I know, and I couldn't agree with you more. You have seen a pivot though with Joe Biden. Certainly in
Mhm.
his State of the Union, and in recent weeks, he's been talking more about public safety and things like that. But it doesn't do the Democrats any favors when we deny the realities that people see every day. In their communities, that they see at the grocery store, that they see when there's a shooting on their block, and there is a big disconnect again between sort of the Democratic pundits in Washington who try to pretend these aren't real issues, the far left people on Twitter, and Democrats in communities across the country. And the one frustrating thing for me sometimes about the Democratic Party is we don't take a beat to really listen to people and listen to their concerns. We saw this in the Virginia governor's race where we just dismissed suburban voters' concerns with education, with school
Right.
closures, with mask mandates, even the, sort of trumped up hysteria around CRT. We didn't take a second to actually listen to them before responding. Instead, we just, sort of blew it off and said, this is all a figment of Fox News's imagination, and that's not how we're going to win over these people.
Or attack them as saying that if you're raising these concerns, you must be because you're a bigot, which of course
Right.
completely shuts down the discussion.
Exactly, exactly. That you're a racist, you're a white supremacist, and where I'm from, insulting the customer is not a great electoral strategy. And Virginia governor's race was a great example of that. And I have seen some polling recently. The NRCC put out some polling recently that showed that voters view the Democrats oftentimes as condescending and out of touch. And that's a big problem for us. And we can't become a party um, that is viewed as school marms, as looking down on everyone, and that calls everyone who disagrees with us homophobe, a racist, a transphobe, a white supremacist, or whatever. We need to start listening to people and understand that there are some legitimate anxieties, legitimate concerns that undergird some of the issues around schools and some of these social issues that we need to address.
So you got me thinking about something. I want to get to some of the issues, including what happens to the midterms if Roe versus Wade is overturned. But to your point about not insulting the customers, one of the things that you all did during the Buttigieg campaign, and afterwards, was that Pete was willing to go on Fox News.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of people's eyebrows went up, like, really, do you actually think that you're going to be able to reach these people? So talk to me a little bit about that thinking, because there's a school of thought that is you have to, the Fox News audience is lost. There's no point talking with them. You cannot reason with them. It is tribal. It is a waste of time. Obviously, you disagree with that. So, what was your thinking and Pete Buttigieg's thinking about saying, I'm going to go right into the belly of the beast and I'm going to talk to them? What were you hoping to accomplish? And do you think you did accomplish anything?
Well, to answer your last question,
Yeah.
yes, I know that we accomplished something. But there are two parts to why Democrats should go on Fox News. One, it's got a massive audience. And sure, there are the dead enders, the people we won't win over who tune in there. But you do have a lot of independents and you do have a lot of Democrats still who watch Fox News. And the Democrats who tend to watch Fox News, a lot of them are, based in more conservative communities. A lot of them are Black Democrats. A lot of them are, Latino Democrats. And when they have their water cooler discussions at their workplaces, they're going to be watching the same things that their coworkers watch, and that's going to be Fox News, not MSNBC. So I do think that there still is a persuadable audience on there. You see a lot of Democrats still who go
Hmm.
on there. You see, Mark Warner's on there a lot. Mark Kelly goes on there a fair amount. Democrats who are, seen as more centrist or who need to win over not just diehard Democrats, but independents and some Republicans. But the second element there is what it signals. Voters still do like bipartisanship. Voters still like
Hmm.
politicians who reach across the aisle in good faith. Um, they aren't, enamored with this nonstop partisan warfare, except for the people on the hard left and hard right. And what it signals when a Democrat goes on Fox News is that there's someone who is willing to work across the aisle. There's someone who respects, Fox News viewers. Maybe someone who's going to bring down the temperature a little bit. And that's what has been a successful recipe for people like Mark Kelly, who is going to have a tough race coming up in November. And so there's both the winning over the audience, but what it signals to voters that you're willing to go on there. Because fundamentally, if you say I'm not going on Fox News, it's disrespectful to all the people
Hmm.
who watch it, and it says to them, I'm too good to go on here. I'm not even going to try to win over your vote. And the
Which
more people
reinforces that stereotype, right? I mean, it
exactly.
reinforces the stereotype. Well, while going on actually explodes the stereotype, because my experience has been, you talk to many of the Fox News listeners, and they have this image of Democrats as, you hate America, you hate God, you hate all things that are good, and then when you go on and you're reasonable, it's like, whoa, okay, well, that's kind of a myth buster.
Right,
It
and
it
it's
has a
harder
certain
for
power.
Yeah, and it's harder for them to caricature Democrats if you go on there, and how can we expect them to believe anything but the caricature of us if we don't go and speak to them directly? And that's why I'm a big believer in sort of piercing these partisan bubbles, and making sure that we talk
Hmm.
to as many different audiences as possible. Now, I'm not saying that Democrats should go on Tucker. I'm not saying that they should go on Laura Ingram's show, but America's Newsroom, Fox and Friends, yeah,
Hmm.
a variety of they're less opinionated shows. I know that, yeah, sometimes Fox and Friends can be crazy town, but that there's value in going on there, going on with Brett Baer, going on Fox News Sunday, and trying to reach those audiences and break through the caricature that some of the audience has of Democrats is a smart idea.
Okay, so I want to get to this question of what happens with Roe sometime this summer, but let's do this on the other side. How do you choose which internet service provider to use? The sad thing is that most of us have very little choice because ISPs operate like monopolies in the regions they serve. They use this monopoly power to take advantage of customers like you. Data caps, streaming throttles, the list goes on. But worst of all, many ISPs log your internet activity and then sell that data to other big tech companies or advertisers. To prevent ISPs from seeing my internet activity, I protect all of my devices with ExpressVPN. So, what is ExpressVPN? It's a simple app for your computer or smartphone that encrypts all of your network data and tunnels it through a secure VPN server so that your ISP cannot see any of your activity. Just think about how much of your life is on the internet. Sadly, the list of people you've messaged, sites you've visited, videos you've watched get tracked by the tech giants who can sell your information for profit. That's the reason that I recommend ExpressVPN as the best way to hide your online activity from your ISP. You just download the app, tap one button on your device, and you are protected. Now, look, I've been doing a lot of searches on Russian information, Russian websites, and frankly, I don't know who's tracking or who is watching this. So I am really grateful that I have ExpressVPN. ExpressVPN does all of this without slowing your connection. That's why it's rated the number one VPN service by Business Insider and The Verge. So stop handing over your personal data to ISPs and other tech giants who mine your activity and sell off your information. Protect yourself with the VPN that I trust to keep me private online. Visit expressvpn.com/bulwark. That's expressvpn.com/bulwark to get 3 extra months free. Go to expressvpn.com/bulwark right now to learn more. Okay, we're back with Lis Smith. Okay, I want to talk about some of the Senate races, the Senate primaries. Right now, a very scrambled picture. But give me your sense. There is a conventional wisdom of which way the midterms are going, and I think conventional wisdom is probably correct. But one of the big wild cards is the Supreme Court decision on Roe. So, what happens in the event that Roe versus Wade is overturned by the conservative majority on the Supreme Court?
Well, you were talking before about sort of what would you need to turn the tide in an election,
Hmm.
and you mentioned 9/11, an event sort of that level. Roe v. Wade is one of those things that could potentially turn the tide for Democrats, that could have a cataclysmic effect on Republicans' chances. Because the reality is that, a majority of Americans are for legalized abortion with, some level of restrictions. But they believe by and large that abortion should be legal when a mother's health, life is at risk, if they're a victim of rape or incest, yada, yada, yada. And for years, we've seen Republicans campaign against Roe v. Wade, for what is it now, 4 decades. And my theory is that it's Republicans' worst nightmare if Roe v. Wade is overturned, because my guess is that they would love to run against it for another 40 years. But when
Oh
it
yeah,
is overturned, it's sort of like the dog that caught the car.
very
What are you
much
guys going
so.
to do then? And this gives the opportunity for Democrats to say, there's some real life and death shit at stake here. And if we don't have a Democratic Senate, this is what happens when we don't have a Democratic Senate. We get a Supreme Court that looks like this. This is what happens when we don't have Democratic governors, Democratic state legislatures. Is you get these state laws that are so extreme that it makes it, nigh on impossible for women facing tough situations to get abortions. And it allows us really to go on the offensive and frame the Republicans as the people who are, completely out of touch and obsessed with culture wars, obsessed with dictating your day to day lives, including very, very personal health choices. And I, it is my hope that Roe v. Wade isn't overturned. I guess we'll have to see what happens. But if it is something that I think will be a big motivating fact for Democrats and something that will bring back the disaffected Biden voters, the some of the people that we saw, defect to Youngkin, for instance, in the Virginia governor's race, bring some of those folks back into the fold because I think that's going to be a bridge too far for a lot of voters.
So speaking of the United States Senate and the Supreme Court, Lindsey Graham said yesterday that if Republicans controlled the Senate, KBJ would not even have been in front of the committee; that they wouldn't have even had a hearing for her. I think there was some wish casting before the hearings began that maybe Republicans would go easy on her. They know that they wouldn't be able to block her. She's an historic appointment. Republicans talk a good game about trying to make inroads into the African American vote, and yet we know how that all turned out. Were you at all surprised by the degree to which Republicans basically decided, apparently, that they didn't give a shit? They didn't care. They were going to go after her. They were going to hammer her. They were going to smear her in any way possible. And I guess I was struck by the fact that that anxiety that existed at one time. Hey, you don't want to appear to be, going over the line or beating up on an African American or beating up on a woman. They just don't care anymore. I mean, they are completely confident that they will pay no political price for this. That this is a winner for them.
So I don't think any of us should have been surprised.
No.
Some of those clips are frankly horrifying to watch of whether it was Ted Cruz or Josh Hawley, Tom Cotton, Lindsey Graham berating her. Lindsey Graham especially, got really hot with her. And, these are some of the most self-serving people in the US Senate. And they're all vying to sort of position themselves as Trump 2.0. So I think they're concerned more about their standing. I think Josh Hawley, Tom Cotton, Ted Cruz are sort of engaged in a race to the bottom to position themselves as, Trump 2.0 in the, in case Trump doesn't run in 2024. But I don't think they necessarily cared about how it looked for the broader GOP
No, they don't.
brand. And the reality is that these hearings were largely overshadowed by the events in Ukraine. But if you look at Jackson, she came in with more support since any Supreme Court justice since John Roberts, and it was a good big win for Democrats because we can now turn to the base and say, look, I know things aren't perfect. I know we haven't fixed everything. I know you're feeling the pain of inflation and everything, but we did deliver this big win for you. And we did,
Hmm.
deliver progressive justice to the Supreme Court. And it gives us a split screen just to use the comments of the Holly, the Cotton, the Cruz, say these guys aren't interested in helping you out day to day and lowering your costs. What they're interested in is, talking about racist babies and pedophiles and these conspiracy theories when we're focused on, delivering you guys relief. And I think it was helpful to Democrats in that regard.
Well, that's interesting because the attacks on Brett Kavanaugh served to mobilize Republican voters, I think, in 2018. You're
Yeah,
suggesting that the attacks on KBJ could mobilize Democratic voters.
they could.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well,
And one other thing I would say about
sure.
Kavanaugh is the way that Democrats handled it did turn off a
Sure.
lot of independents too. I mean, it was a disaster of a hearing, and I saw Murkowski's statement yesterday saying that these hearings have become completely divorced from reality, have become complete circuses. And I couldn't agree more. And I just don't know how we sort of unring that bell and make it so that
Right.
these aren't just these apocalyptic events anymore.
No, I think this has now become our political reality. All right, so on the Senate is very much in play. It strikes me is that both political parties are, might lose unlosable seats. So tell me that the Senate primaries, the Senate races that you're most interested in, that you're paying the most attention to.
um, it- well, big Senate races. We've got Wisconsin, Pennsylvania,
Hmm.
Georgia. Um,
Ohio.
I oh yeah, Ohio, and
Okay.
I'm close to Tim Ryan. I've been watching that race closely, and rather than them off, I'll just sort of uh,
Yeah.
talk about some of them that I find interesting. Ohio, it used to be a swing state. It is trended redder and redder over the years. But it's interesting to me in that Tim Ryan is someone who is really stiff arming the culture wars and just leaning very, very hard into economic issues. And, he came out with an ad last week that was just all about China and, China's global competitor and the need for us to be able to compete on a global stage with China. It's a powerful message in Ohio. It's one that Democrats have, like Obama, Sherrod Brown, have used to their advantage in the few elections that Democrats have won there in recent years. And I think it's a really smart strategy, especially when you see the Republican primary has become, crazy town.
Oh
And
my
you
God. Yeah.
have, sort of a sociopath and JD Vance running against a psychopath and Josh Mandel. It's a true race to the bottom of, who can be phonier, who can be Trumpier, who can deny the results of the last election more. And it's one of those situations where you could see in a tough environment that you would never think Democrats have an opportunity to win a seat like that. But if Republicans do nominate someone like Josh Mandel and you do have a Tim Ryan going out there being extremely disciplined, that they could beat back the trend.
The same situation in Georgia, where Republicans appear to be poised to nominate Herschel Walker. Now, again, given the climate of the year, it would seem that Warnock, the incumbent Democrat, would be really, really vulnerable. The Republicans have a great chance to pick up that seat. Are Republicans at risk of blowing that seat by putting up somebody as problematic as Herschel Walker, or am I underestimating his celebrity clout?
Yeah, and again, and Herschel Walker is one of the more problematic Republican, candidates this cycle. You have a similar thing in Missouri with Eric Greitens, who's
Yeah,
right now being accused of abuse by his ex-wife, on top of having to resign for,
run for
tying up a
governor.
woman in his basement, taking photos of her naked, trying to blackmail her with them, et cetera, et cetera.
This is how
And
naive I am. I would have thought that those things would have been disqualifying, but what do I know?
well, in a Democratic primary,
Yeah, I
maybe,
know.
but
You would
it just
think,
seems
yeah.
like all that. It just seems like in the post-Trump era that none of these things matter anymore for
No.
Republicans and the
Well,
party. Yeah,
Greitens is really testing the limits of the post-shame, Trump era, isn't he, though?
right. No, and that really will be the ultimate test. But there's another story that came out this morning about Greitens, where his ex-wife says
Oh.
she has photos documenting some of the abuse against his family. So, yeah,
Oh,
Republicans do have, issues in these primaries where they could go too far and nominate someone who is sort of beyond the pale. And it calls to mind the Alabama primary where Republicans lined up behind Roy Moore, and we all know what happened there. But Democrats, we do have some issues. We have some issues on our own side. And you're pretty familiar with Wisconsin, and that
yeah.
is
Yep.
a primary that should create some agita for Democrats. And to be clear, the issues that we face on our side are people embracing policies that are, too far left outside the mainstream. They're not
Well,
embracing conspiracy theories. They're
yeah.
not accused of being, wife abusers or things like that. So I'm not at all trying to equate the two things. But if Democrats embrace these policies and lose, that's a big problem for us. And
Oh, so
Wisconsin, it is Exhibit
yeah.
A.
Well, okay. Well, I agree with you completely on that. I am on record as saying, look, Ron Johnson is incredibly vulnerable. He's deeply underwater, but he can be reelected. He can win
Yeah.
if the Democrats nominate somebody who can credibly be accused of, wanting to abolish ICE and defunding police, and again, yada yada yada. But Mandela Barnes is the leading candidate, the sitting incumbent lieutenant governor. If he wins that primary and he is the front runner, I think Ron Johnson gets another 6 years in office.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
look, I mean, Mandela Barnes is an Oppo research dream. I mean, he posted a picture of himself holding up a T-shirt saying "Abolish ICE" that had been sent to him by the Democratic Socialists of America. He has spoken at the defund police rallies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's not going to be hard, a heavy lift for Republicans to be able to do that. And again, I understand all of the baggage that and the radicalism and the irresponsibility and the recklessness of Ron Johnson, but knowing Wisconsin politics, knowing what the climate is this year, the Democrats nominate Mandela Barnes, they hand the seat away. Give me your sense of Pennsylvania, though. Pennsylvania is another seat that I think that Democrats have a reasonable shot at, or should at least on paper. But you have a centrist Democrat, almost from central casting centrist Democrat, Connor Lamb, trailing the much, much, much more progressive John Fetterman. Is that analogous? Do you see that in the same
Yeah.
way as Wisconsin?
I do, except Fetterman does have, some cred. He's someone who hasn't gone super far left and uh,
Yeah.
called for banning fracking and things like that. I know Mandela is in support of the Green New Deal, which I think is just going to be is extremely tone
Toxic.
deaf in the current environment when people are really concerned about gas prices. And another concern that I have about Fetterman is, this incident in his past where he sort of, chased down when he was mayor of Braddock, and he chased down a black jogger with a gun because, he, thought that some crime or something had been committed. And if I'm the Republicans, I would just, carpet bomb black radio
They will.
with that in the general election to depress turnout. And this is a tactic that didn't get a ton of attention in both 2016 and 2020. But that is what Trump did on black radio in Milwaukee, and I know I've talked to a lot of folks in Michigan, in Detroit, where he went super hard against Hillary Clinton for her super predator comments,
Yeah.
super hard against Joe Biden on his support for the crime bill. And I would be afraid that Republicans could run with that playbook again and have a candidate like McCormick who can try to run youngkin kind of race. So I,
I think that's
personally,
exactly right. Yeah.
yeah. So I think that there are two issues there, which is one, on certain issues like Medicare for all, John Fetterman has embraced issues that are outside the mainstream. When Democratic voters have Medicare for all explained to them, a majority of them don't support it. That is just not a winner in a general election. But then there's this other issue where I could see
Yeah.
Republicans using his issues to depress base turnout.
Oh, I think you can absolutely bank on that. I don't think there's any question about it whatsoever. And you're right. Oh, I mean, Connor Lamb at the debate they had over the weekend that Fetterman didn't show up at said, "Look, the socialist label can be stuck on him. I mean, he's a
Yep.
former, he has supported Bernie Sanders. He's out there. He's tried to walk back from some of the more extreme positions. But if you're McCormick, if he were to win that primary." that's a matchup Republicans really would like. I think, as opposed to running against a mainstream centrist type Democrat. But again, you're really seeing this contrast in the Democratic primaries in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, I think the most dramatically. At least that's
Yeah,
my
and
take.
one thing that we've seen is voters really do value independence. They value bipartisanship. Again, these aren't sexy things. They don't get a ton of traffic on cable news. They don't drive traffic on cable news, but they're the things that's what voters like. And Connor Lamb has certainly been independent in Washington. He's got a great bio. He's a veteran, and he is someone who
Has
isn't
won
toxic.
elections.
He's won elections in tough
Yeah.
districts
Yeah.
and is not all about partisan conflict. He's about getting things done. And I think that the more Democrats we have that are focused on results, solutions, working across the aisle to get that done, I think those are the types of Democrats that will win in 2022.
Lis Smith, thank you so much. Our mutual friend Tim Miller has been saying for months, you have to get Liz on the podcast. She will be great. Actually, you exceeded all expectations. Thank you so much.
Great. And thanks. I considered Tim my brother from another mother. So thank you to Tim. And Charlie, thank you so much for having me on. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Well, thank you. It was great. And we will definitely have you back on. The Bulwark podcast is produced by Katie Cooper with audio production by Jonathan Siri. I'm Charlie Sykes. Thank you for listening to today's Bulwark podcast. And we'll be back tomorrow. We'll do this all over again.
We're all juggling life, a career, and trying to build a little bit of wealth. The Brown Ambition podcast with host Mandy and Tiffany the Budgetnista can help with special guest Chris Browning.
I'll give a shout out. I have two coworkers, Mandy, who love your podcast. They found out about me podcasting because of the last time I was on your podcast.
That's
Brown Ambition.
We outed you.
Yeah, you did. So spread it out a little bit further.
Chances are, if you work in an office with Black women, Brown Ambition is somewhere.
Brown Ambition. Listen wherever you get your podcasts. 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 Wherever you get your podcasts.